This year marks the 50th birthday of your favourite Sunday World newspaper. To celebrate, we're looking back over some of the front page stories and the scandals with the big name journalists who made it the people's paper. So join us to reel in the years over the coming weeks on Crime World. Sunday World is 50, a Crime World special. You wrote a piece for us recently in the newspaper saying one of your more modest contributions to the Sunday World was the actual title of the paper. That is probably one of the biggest brands in Ireland over the last few decades.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it was back in 1973, and Jerry McGuinness, who was the senior figure in the creation group, decided to start a newspaper, and he told me how he went along to his bank manager to try and get funding, and the bank manager said, "I'll give you money to back a horse.
Yeah.
As for this idea of starting a newspaper, just forget it." And himself and his business partner managed to raise the money through other means, and then the question arose as to what to call the new newspaper, and there was a meeting held, and people had come up with various ideas. And I remember somebody had suggested Sunday Morning.
Yeah.
And I didn't think that would work. I could imagine phoning up somebody and saying, "This is Sunday Morning here," and some smart ass replying, "Well, it's Wednesday evening where I am," So
you get fed up listening to that after a while.
Yeah. So I thought about it overnight, and I decided, well, Sunday should be part of the title. And then the News of the World was very popular at the time, and I said to myself, well, why not go with Sunday World? So I came in and gave him suggested that title, and ultimately he went with that title.
It was used, yeah.
Yeah.
And the Sunday Morning, of course, later in the day, you'd feel like you were buying an old product. And the whole idea of newspapers is that you're getting them back in the day. People now get all this on their phones and their other devices, but that you were getting something fresh off the newsstands. And it had to last the day, didn't it? The paper would have been bought after Mass on a Sunday, largely all around the country.
Yes.
But people were also going to be buying it that evening. And they didn't want to be buying the Sunday Morning. It would have felt stale.
Well, exactly. Yeah, that was another thought. So anyway, he went with that. He may have carried out some market research, I'm not sure. But nowadays, I'm sure that you'd hire a whole team of consultants to consider a name that might appeal to the public. And so that's one of my modest claims.
Did you get paid for that? No?
No, I didn't. No.
You got paid enough over the years, I reckon, Sean.
Yeah.
So where did you come out of, and why were you at that meeting even for the beginning of the Sunday World?
I'd started in the Irish press in the 60s, and I had a great time there, and spent a short time in the Fleet Street office of the Irish press, and was up the north covering the start of the Troubles. And then I went to a magazine, This Week, edited by Joe O'Malley. And after a period, that magazine came to an end, and the bosses in creation, Jerry McGuinness and Hugh McLaughlin, decided to start a new newspaper. So we began working on the new newspaper. So
what was, or are your memories of that first edition? What was the week like? What were the stories like? And what did it feel like as it came off the printing presses?
Well, it's so long ago. Joe Kennedy was the editor at the time. Kevin Marin was a very important part of the team. He was the deputy editor, great columnist, great writer, and he had a big following. Micheline McCormick was the woman's editor. And it was a very exciting day when it came off the presses, and the minister at the time, Keating, Labour minister, he Minister for Industry and Commerce, I think he was, he came in and he symbolically pressed the button to start the presses, and there were photographs taken and all of that. And I can't remember much about the rest of it.
The splash must not have been memorable.
The splash wasn't too bad, but
Yeah,
it wasn't the greatest, I have to
yeah.
say.
It wasn't going to set the world on fire.
No, no,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
no, no. But and then for a few weeks, we weren't sure it was going to last or not.
Mm,
And then there was a break-even point, and then ultimately they passed the break-even point. So
hmm.
it seemed likely that it was there to
It
stay,
was there to
at
stay.
least for the foreseeable future. And then it gradually built up circulation over the years.
Yeah. Now it was a bit racy. It was, it was a bit controversial, I suppose.
Mm.
And but it sort of seems to me to have just settled in to part and parcel of Ireland.
Well, it settled in very well, and it was kind of like a campaigning newspaper as well. And it was the years before Liveline, and you get calls from people all over Ireland about their local problems and so forth. And so many of them you couldn't do anything about.
Hmm.
But from time to time there were good stories there that you could follow up on.
You were sitting on the news desk, is that right?
No,
No, not initially.
Liam McGowan was the first news editor.
Right.
He was a real veteran. Um, he had uh, he had a Republican past. He had been on Fublucht in the 1930s, I think, and then he was in the Irish press, and he was famed for the story he covered about the Tatey hookers from Achill Island who went to Scotland and were burned when their huts went on fire. And it was said that Fleet Street reporters were going down and say, "What happened, mate?" And these people could not relate to
Right.
these guys.
Foreigners.
And Liam McGowan is said to have gone in and said, many were Irish speakers, and he
Yeah.
said, Codda Harla,
Right.
what happened? And he got the whole story. And apparently they weren't going to send him, except that the guy whom they would normally send wasn't available, so they sent Liam instead. Liam was incidentally a native Irish speaker. He came from Valentia Island.
So he was a good pair of hands on the
Oh
news
yeah,
desk,
yeah,
obviously. Now
yeah,
you
yeah.
would end up on
And he was
the
a great, marvelous writer as well.
yeah,
And he didn't have to agonize when he was writing a column.
yeah.
It just flowed out.
So you'd end up on the news desk yourself for many, many
Eventually,
years,
yeah.
and
Mm,
we'll get to that later.
mm.
But in the meantime, um, so I think I know it all when it comes to cocaine, but I thought one of the first busts or the first kind of bales of cocaine only started rolling into our shores in the 80s. But I'm wrong. You have
Well,
an earlier tale.
in the mid-70s, there was a rather remarkable development. Two guys of Hispanic background were arrested by the drug squad. The drug squad at that time was headed by Dinny Mullins, a very astute policeman,
Mm,
and for whom I personally had a very high regard. I thought he had a very good social conscience. He's prepared to talk to community groups and so forth. And they also had their ear to the ground. They knew what was happening. And so two guys came into Dublin. They said they were from Madrid. Some cocaine was seized. I don't think it was a huge seizure, but I thought this was a very interesting development. And I can't remember the sequence of events, but I must have phoned the DEA, the American Drugs
yeah, yeah.
Enforcement Agency, to find out what the background was to cocaine, about the cocaine trafficking. And I happened to speak to this guy. It must have been in the American Embassy in London.
Yeah.
I reckon that's where I must have talked to him. And he said, "Oh yeah," he says, went into Mountjoy and saw those guys, and I recognized them as people who are of interest to us."
Yeah.
I can't remember the term that he used, but obviously he regarded these as people who were on their radar, so to speak.
And these were likely Colombians then, rather than
I think
Spanish.
I have a vague memory of Peru being mentioned.
These were cartel men if they were on the radar of them.
Possibly.
So that moment, I mean, that idea that pure journalism, isn't it? Just going that extra step to just check something, to just chance
Exactly.
your arm.
Yeah,
And all of a sudden, you've that one nugget of information that
yeah.
transforms a story from something ordinary into something extraordinary.
That's very true. And sometimes, like, it pays to make the extra phone call, go the
Mhm.
extra mile. You never know what's going to happen.
Yeah,
And very often you make these phone calls and nothing happens, but occasionally you strike lucky.
yeah.
And that was the score in this situation. And so the two guys were given bail, and then they just disappeared and were never seen
Never
again.
seen or heard him
Yeah, never
again.
seen or heard again. And the case was disposed of at the court. So it would have been no longer sub judice.
Yeah.
And well, I wouldn't have thought so. But anyway, I wrote a story about that. You
Now,
know.
I hope I'm not catching you off guard on this, but we were talking beforehand. I was saying to you, I thought the sort of the first cocaine baron, as such, or cowboy, whatever you call him, was Eamon Kelly, who was jailed in the very early 90s after he was caught in a plot to import cocaine from Miami, if I'm right. He had travelled out to Miami, I think, and he'd met an Irish guy out there, and they'd used a mule to transport it on a plane, and they
Mm.
were caught in at the Burlington or something like that.
That's right. I don't know if Kelly traveled out to Miami, but anyway, a Cuban lady living in Miami came into Dublin Airport, and she had. I'm not sure if one can say this, but she was quite a big lady,
Hmm.
and it was discovered she had bales of cocaine strapped to her body
Right.
underneath her clothes. And she was arrested, and also arrested was Eamon Kelly
Yeah.
and a man called Frank Conlon. And I had known about Frank Conlon because I'd been in Miami a couple of years before that, following up a couple of stories. And
What
this
sort of
guy,
stories were you following up in
well,
Miami?
I was
Sounds very jet setty.
um, I was inquiring into the arms business
Right.
for a possible book. The book
Hmm.
never materialized.
Mm.
But a guy, and then there was another story about sanctions busting that I was doing for the paper as well, to do with Iran and Aer Lingus, or not Aer Lingus directly, but
Right.
another company
But you had kind of come across this name, Conlon,
by
from those
chance.
inquiries, or he had come into your radar slightly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was talking to this guy who was in the arms business, and he said, you should talk to your fellow Irishman who lives
Mm.
down in Miami Beach, a guy called Frank Conlon. And there was a very tight schedule, and I didn't have time to go looking for him. I had to move on elsewhere. But the name stuck in my mind.
Yeah.
And then sometime later, uh, through another chance, I learned from a contact in Germany that there was a Stasi file on Frank Conlon. And I went to Hamburg and I got the Stasi file.
Well, can I ask you how?
Well, I don't want to go into too much detail,
Yeah.
but this guy had a way of getting
Yeah.
the file, and I got the file. And it detailed how he had been doing arms deals in East Germany. Now, spoke to him afterwards, um, later years, and if memory serves me right, he said that he was acquiring arms for the Americans who were who were assisting the Afghan Mujahideen who were fighting the Russian invaders. In the early years of the insurgency against the Russians, the CIA were sending in non-attributable weapons, weapons that originated in the East Bloc, so that it couldn't be traced back to America.
To them, yeah, of
And they
course.
were
Yeah.
using cutouts and intermediaries and arms dealers for this. And it would appear that Frank Conlon, who worked for an arms company in London,
Mm.
was one of these. He also operated in Romania. He had an office there.
So this, Sean, was his, John Francis Conlon's, legitimate work, even though it sounds, a bit tricky. He starts off life somewhere in Ireland and ends up working for an arms firm
Yeah,
in the UK, ultimately becomes a dealer between the US and the Mujahideen.
yeah.
Um, So he's met some interesting people along the way, gets a gaff in Miami Beach,
Yes.
and how does he? Well, Miami,
Well,
of course, is the center of the cocaine trade.
well, he was arrested in Dublin, and then he skipped bail and went to England to get a very glamorous girlfriend called Beverly in England.
And as Eamon Kelly, the famous Eamon Kelly, who was murdered in 2012, but worked as a mentor to many gangland underlings, including Eamon the Don Dunn, as he went to trial and actually got a very lengthy sentence for cocaine trafficking. Him
That's
and
right.
that mule lady, as far as I recall, went to trial, and they were both jailed. But Conlon goes on the run.
Yeah, and the Cuban lady, by the way, got off afterwards on appeal because there was some problem with a search warrant, I think.
Right.
So she went back to, I presume, to Miami.
An innocent woman.
Yeah, and so then Conlon was arrested in England by the British police, and he was being held in Brixton Prison pending extradition to Ireland. And his girlfriend contacted the paper because I'd written about him.
Yeah.
And I went over. She thought it'd be advantageous for him to meet a journalist. So I went over, and she brought me into Brixton to meet him, you know. I can't recall much about the conversation, quite honestly.
Right, but you can recall going into Brixton.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And then he eventually stopped resisting extradition, and he was sent back to Ireland. And he appeared in court, and he got a 10-year sentence with 5 years suspended. And then with time, I think they took into account the time he spent in prison in England. So he was out fairly quickly. And I met him after that. Kelly, meanwhile, got, I think, 14 years. And he launched a couple of appeals. And one appeal was because he said it emerged that Conlon was an informant for US federal authorities and for the British police. And so he was claiming through his lawyers that this was not disclosed to him.
And that he had been entrapped, essentially.
I think that could have been the argument that would have led to that argument.
And was Conlon?
He was entrapped. I think Conlon did have connections there, because I established that he was very close to a US customs investigator, you know. And the idea would be that if there's a big drugs bust, Conlon would get a percentage or reward money or something like that.
And you know, you had already established through your earlier journalism that he would have had a lot of contacts pretty high up in US intelligence if he's the middleman.
He wasn't necessarily in direct contact with the CIA. The CIA, he mentioned the name of the guy he was dealing with. I can't remember. But this guy was probably a cutout between the arms dealers and the CIA, you know.
But I mean, he had serious connections, so it's not that great a leap to consider that he was working for the DEA or whoever.
Yes, I think.
I mean, that was at a time that the US were very much trying to get intel into Pablo Escobar's network. They were concerned that Escobar was looking towards Europe as a new market. Now, as time went on, the Colombians did take over the European market. It was hugely lucrative, and they were able to set the price and the tonnage coming.
And the other aspect of this is that Conlon was an associate of one of the mercenaries who were deployed who were hired by the Cali cartel to assassinate Pablo Escobar. You know, they didn't succeed, but that's well documented. There are books and documentaries about that
on Conlon. And you kept in touch with him up until
up until about 25 years ago, or just over 20 years ago. Unfortunately, it's embarrassing and mixed up over mobile numbers. I lost his mobile number, and I had him on my mobile number is on a floppy disk.
Is it possibly still alive?
I think it's possible. Yeah, he could. Well, he in his 80s now. He was born 1940,
Yeah.
so he could still be
Well, he
alive.
could be listening. If he's any interest in crime, all things crime still,
Yeah,
please get
yeah,
in contact and we'll put you
yeah.
on to Sean. Um,
The other guy, the mercenary fellow, by the way, that he was in touch with was Dave Tompkins, and they both had an association with the famous or notorious Mansour al-Qassar, a Syrian-born arms dealer and hashish smuggler. And long story short, Al-Qassar, I think this would have been in the 80s, had a big mansion in Marbella, and he had a plot to lure two Israeli arms dealers to Amsterdam, and he was going to cooperate with an extremist Palestinian group in having them assassinated. And Colin found out about this and raised the alarm and basically saved the lives of the two Israelis. And so Alcazar uh, found out that Conlon was the source of the leak, and he asked Dave Tompkins to assassinate Frank Conlon.
right.
And Tompkins told me that himself, and he says, "Well, I said to Monzer, he says, I regard Frank as a nice, sociable fellow, and there's no way going to harm him, you know." So he didn't take on the hit, you know.
We need more guys like
Yeah.
that nowadays. I should sort of say that, like your view of that emerging drugs trade and criminality really was way ahead of your time, and you were seeing the international stage, and where some Irish guys were punching above their weight, and where Ireland sat. I mean, where everyone sat. Organized crime is a global phenomenon. It's not something that can really be understood if you just look inwards to your own country.
Mm,
And in recent times, now that has become very clear, I think, to everybody when you see the Kinahan
mm,
cartel, their links into Hezbollah, the funding of Hezbollah through drug
mm,
shipments and money laundering.
mm.
Um, your interest in that and why you sort of stood, you stood a head and shoulders above a lot of others in seeing that worldview of crime was because of your interest in arms. And didn't you work for, or where did you get that from? Where did that originate? Like,
Well, I did a story back in the 80s. I've almost forgotten the details now, but there was um, the Syrians were buying this equipment from Israel, from basically Israeli made equipment, which they needed for their scientific department in
mm,
Damascus. And uh, it was being channeled through Dublin. Um, and it was being passed off as being Irish made. And I have a suspicion that the Syrians knew it was Israeli and that the Israelis knew it was going to Syria. Uh, it was it wasn't lethal equipment per se, it was dual use equipment. So that sparked my interest in
mm-hmm,
the covert side of the arms trade.
mm,
And then I began to do some articles for Jane's Information Group in the UK. Uh, First of all, I decided I'd try and do a book on gun running and on arms stealing around the world, and I spoke to a number of arms dealers. The book on arms dealers didn't materialize, but I used some of that expertise for a book I did in 2005 called Gun Runners, and that was about the way that paramilitary groups in Ireland, both loyalist and Republican, acquired weapons from abroad during the years of the Troubles, you know, and it brought in to the arms crisis. As a young reporter with the Irish Press, I was on the press gallery on the famous night when Jack Lynch announced the sacking of Haughey and Boland. Sorry, not Haughey and Blaney, you know, and so. So anyway, I used some of the research I did for the arms dealing book, which then materialized for the gun runners book published in 2005.
Mm.
And that gave me an interest in that area. And then I branched out on a
It gave you the ability
part-time.
as well, I suppose, to see a story for the Sunday World and to make it so special because you have all that background information. You're able to join the dots. You're able to see where
Yeah.
this story sits on the international stage.
Mm,
Um, I think that's really interesting that you were doing that all the way back then when now
mm,
it feels like it's new. Um,
yeah.
but of course, the Sunday World was not only about traveling to Miami and,
Mm,
getting files in Germany on arms dealers.
mm.
There was also lots of local stories that happened on the ground here in Ireland that sometimes the international criminals would come to us, and many of them were living around the country, and you were sent out on the road to track them down and, to confront them, I'm sure, and ask them some questions. So who is memorable in those kind of.
Well, there's one particular story that really intrigued me, and I never managed to get to the bottom of it. But around in the early 70s, no, it would have been around mid 70s, there was a book on the market about the Cray twins by John Pearson. And there was a throwaway line in that about Reggie Cray. After his wife died, well, it was judged to be a suicide. Um, he was very troubled and was thinking of going to get away from it all. And North Africa was one place that was mentioned. And he also considered going to Bantry Bay, where he had bought property. He and Frances Shea, his wife, had bought property. I was
Was she Irish?
No, she was English, but with a name like Shea,
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if she was of Irish descent. And of course, Shea is a popular, or O'Shea is a popular name in Cork and Kerry.
Mm.
So I decided I'd ring around the estate agents, and I struck lucky with the very first estate agent I phoned. And he said, "Oh, yes, we had Mr. Reggie Cray in here and Francis Shea." And it was more than a piece of land that they bought. The piece of land was what the phrase that the writer used in his book. So I immediately jumped in the car and went down to talk to him in more detail. But by the time I arrived, he had totally clammed up and wasn't even available to see me. So I never found out
Where?
where in West Cork Reggie Cray had his piece of land, and was there a house on it?
Yeah.
I don't know. Could it be down the Bear Peninsula or the Sheep's Head Peninsula? And what happened to the piece of land?
Extraordinary.
I just never
Well, you got
found out.
close. I mean, that was closer than anybody else.
Got close. At least I confirmed what was in the
Absolutely.
book,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because a lot of interesting characters came here, and I suppose this was seen, especially for UK crooks, um, it was seen as near home. People
Yeah.
could visit, English speaking, you could hide out. And I think the cops were seen as being very sort of preoccupied with terrorism. And they could also, by the way, so many parts of the countryside were and are full of these very eccentric sort of blow-ins, as they call them,
Yeah,
from
exactly.
all over Europe.
One particular blow-in that occurs to me is James Humphreys, and he was a notorious gangster, I suppose you'd call him, from operating in Soho. He was involved in the vice trade, involved in pornography and so forth, and a little bit of violence here and there. And he surfaced in Knocklong in County Tipperary around the early 80s. And he was breeding greyhounds, but this seems to have been a cover for an amphetamines factory that he had. And the guards raided the amphetamines factory, but he'd done a runner just a short time before that and went off to Mexico and then America. And I have a recollection that we got an interview with him somewhere over there.
Right.
I wasn't directly involved, but it may have been in Mexico, open to correction here.
Mm-hmm.
And then himself and his wife, Rusty, they came back to the UK in the late 80s, and they began operating brothels, and they were both busted, and he ultimately died in the early 2000s, I think.
Yeah.
So he was another example of a guy who found a boat hole in Ireland. And
Unbelievable.
then there was another guy called Green,
Mickey Green.
Mickey
Yeah.
Green.
Hmm.
And the reason how he surfaced was that he was driving his Bentley and he broke a red light and killed his most unfortunate taxi man who had a large family. And he didn't pay much of a penalty for that, you know.
Mm. I
And
mean, Mickey Green was one of the biggest cocaine dealers on the planet and had had an incredible life and, was linked to back to the Wembley mob. I think he was a member of the Wembley mob. He had spent time in jail and
mm,
he ended up in Spain, in America. He was in Ireland because he was in the process of being extradited from the US to France,
mm,
and the plane stopped off in Shannon in order to refuel. He'd an Irish passport up his sleeve and he simply walked off.
my God,
That's how he
I wasn't aware of that.
There you go.
That's
That's how he
amazing.
ended up in Ireland and stayed here for quite some time until that incident happened.
Mm.
Um, yeah. Were your transition? I mean, what an amazing career on the road. And you were obviously a very tenacious journalist who left no stone uncovered. And, you know, sometimes I'm sure that could have been a time wasting exercise, but also you have these fantastic stories to tell. The transition to the news desk of the Sunday World, which is traditionally a job where you're sort of managing everybody else, and
Yes.
all these
Mm.
very colourful characters that have always seemed to be drawn to the Sunday World.
Mm.
Um, did you sort of like the idea of that, or did you feel like you were leaving part of the excitement behind?
Well, I suppose there was a mixture of it. I had some very good people working for me, you know, the top class journalists, you know. Paul Williams came in,
Yeah.
and I worked with a guy from Fleet Street once, and he had this phrase, horses for courses. And Paul came in and he said he wanted to be a security correspondent. So I said, fine. And he built it up in fairness to him, you
Yeah.
know,
It was a different time
yeah,
of criminality then, really. It was
yeah.
going into the more organized
Mm,
crime and dangerous.
mm. So, I mean, my role would have been to just give him his head, so to speak. And he got great contacts going as well. Um,
But the 70s, you were saying, was the
Yeah,
sort of
yeah,
the
the
beginning of the
70s,
heroin
the
epidemic.
heroin began coming in then, and that was a very bad time for the inner city, you know. And members of the Dunn family were involved, Larry Dunn in particular. I got to know a little bit Bronco Dunn, and he was different to the others. He wasn't involved in hard drugs, and I don't think he approved of hard drugs. I don't like the term ordinary decent criminal because there's nothing decent about criminality, but he um, he was not involved, so far as I can see. He was never convicted, and I don't think he was involved in the hard drugs. And he was on the run at one stage for something. I can't remember what it was. And he wrote me a letter, and he had a certain way with words, and it was headlined "Christy Dunn on the Run." And he was jailed for a tiger kidnapping that happened in the early 90s, but he always protested his innocence, you
Still
know.
is, would you believe?
So, yeah, so I say. And I remember one occasion he showed me a guard intelligence file. I don't know how he could have got his hands on this. There were pictures of all the members of the Dunn family who were involved in crime
Mm.
and details of their convictions and stuff, and members of another family related to the Dunns. And I still don't know. He didn't say how he got that. Still don't know how he got
Mm.
his hands on that, you know.
Sean, when did you retire?
I retired in 2009. I was political correspondent or political
Of
editor, as they
course.
call it,
I-
in my
In the
final years there from
in the
about,
final, what, 5 years?
no, it was about from late 90s, I think, up
Right,
until 2009 when I retired.
right.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
did you love it?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, it was a totally different and got to know. uh, a lot of the politicians,
Yeah.
based in Leinster House a lot of the time. And one of the stories I did as a political correspondent, I was told about the night that Charlie Haughey was born, that this man, he was in the Free State Army. He was a colleague of Charlie's father, who was also in the Free State Army. They were based down in County Mayo. And so I tracked down this man. He was quite elderly, he must have been in his 90s at this stage. He lived to be over 100. Sean Clancy, Lieutenant Colonel Sean Clancy. And he described how he was playing cards with Charlie's father and a few other people in the house. And Mrs. Haughey was expecting a baby upstairs. And the midwife arrived, and the maid came in, and she said that it might be best to abandon the card game as Mrs. Haughey was giving birth upstairs. And then he said, he used almost biblical language. He said, the next day we heard the marvelous news that a boy had been born and that his name would be Cottle. And in fact, older people used to refer to Charlie Haughey as Cottle.
Yeah.
Liam McGowan, for instance, the first news editor of the Sunday World, when he would phone Charlie Haughey, he'd call him Cottle. And he'd say, Cottle, Alana, Cottle, my baby.
But like, what was that? That was so particularly Irish that people were constantly getting christened one name and then the name changed.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, my own father, when he died, we only discovered that his name wasn't his name at all.
Yeah.
And it was only when he died, and he had passports and everything in this
I know.
sort of faker name. What was that about?
I don't know. Somebody
Just
said
changed their minds.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Somebody said to me, by the way, that I should send a copy of the article to Charlie Haughey.
Yeah.
And I did.
Did you?
And a few days later, I was sitting out on the plinth in Leinster House, and my mobile phone rang, and this rasping voice said, is that Mr. Boyne? I thought it was, and then he said, I said, yes. And then he said, this is Charlie Haughey here. I thought it was Paul Williams, who was a great mimic.
He was, yeah. Or is, yes.
Who is a great mimic, getting it up for me. And then it emerged it really was Charlie Haughey. And he says, I want to thank you for the article, enjoyed reading it. Marvellous man, Sean Clancy, and really must go and see him. And then I said to him, Mr. Haughey, it'd be remiss of me not to ask you about the possibility of an interview. I was appearing before the tribunal down in Dublin Castle at the time. And he says, well, at the moment, I'm doing this big interview down in Dublin Castle, but come back to me at a later stage, So unfortunately, the interview never materialized,
So do you still think like a journalist?
Yes, it's hard to shake it off. And you find yourself thinking in terms of headlines, and I must bore my friends because I hear something happen and immediately translates into a headline,
But you always see the potential of things that you
see the potential of things, but I'm not involved obviously anymore.
It's an awful thing to have that constantly weighing on you then, isn't it? Imagine just being able to go through a day or a conversation without constantly seeing.
No, it's not really that bad. I'm just being facetious there, but it's good not to have the demands of a daily deadline that you can relax, that you can, or even a weekly deadline that you can, go for a long walk or drive out into the country or whatever.
Do you still scratch about a bit for stories and?
Not really. No.
So you're telling me if John Francis Conlon hears this, calls me up and asks me for your number, you're not interested?
Well, I would certainly love to talk to him.
Yeah.
And then I branched out into writing books.
Yeah.
I did a couple of books, and
when was your last book?
Well, I did a biography of Emmett Dalton. It was published by, he was with Michael Collins when Collins was killed at Bain Blah. And I did it in a kind of a quasi-academic way. It was published by Irish Academic Press. I tried to kind of bring some level of academic credibility to it in terms of footnotes for archival footnotes and stuff like that. I did a degree in history and politics many
Yeah.
years ago in UCD, so it was reasonably well received. And then I came across, when I was doing research for that book in the military archives, I came across letters to do with an incident during the War of Independence I'd never heard about, a woman who was disappeared in West Cork called Bridget Noble. So I decided I'd inquire into that, and so that was my follow-up book.
Yeah.
I did it through Amazon, and it's a ebook and a paperback, and
Are you working on anything now?
I have a couple of ideas, but
Yeah.
nothing really
You
definite.
wouldn't take on 50 years of Sunday World?
I don't. There's a lot of work involved.
There for somebody. A lot of research work involved, which might take you to the pub.
Maybe too many things to hide as well.
Yeah,
You know.
well, this is it. You wonder sometimes, are the best stories the ones we can't tell?
Exactly. You know,
Because
and
we've
have to
both
think the
heard.
laws of libel and all that. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was only coming in here when you were leaving, and I've had an equally fun time, I have to say, in the Sunday World. It's been a great
Yeah.
place to work.
Mm.
Something special about it. I've
Yeah.
never heard anybody complain about their time in it or their years in it, and
Mm.
you were very well respected and still spoken about.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Very much so. Everybody always talks about you with great kindness when you were on the desk, all the help that you gave people, the advice, and sometimes when you're out in the road trying to find a story, maybe it's in your head or you already have it. Sometimes
Mm.
you can't see that, and it's a good news editor who just shows you the light.
Mm.
Um, so I think Sean Boyne for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Enjoyed the interview. Thanks a lot.
Great.